Okay, so thank you, Steve, for the introduction and the invitation, and thank you, Lisa, for the local arrangements and for all your years of extraordinary service. And thank you all for being here. So the way I understand it, a lunch talk should be A, not too long, B, not too depressing. So my goal is to meet both requirements despite the small word grief in my title, so wish me luck. Like a lot of you and Hillary Clinton, Mark Zuckerberg, I've been thinking about the power of fact-free narratives. We historians are basically evidence-based storytellers. Bill Cronin, among others, has argued for a return to our roots. From Los Angeles to Iowa City to Stockholm, universities have funded environmental initiatives on narrative. At our best, though, we historians are tellers of old-fashioned, long-form, single-reader, complex narratives. That's a problem. We live in a gilded dark age of simplistic stories, now augmented or defined by images, shareable, monetized, now weaponized narratives that feel true because they confirm pre-existing biases. By contrast, historical writing mainly destabilizes received wisdom. Even on a day without distractions and notifications and updates and alerts, most people don't welcome that influence, and even those who do increasingly don't want it in book-length form. Some might say we should stick to what we do best. After all, historical writing is a practice that dates to antiquity and has endured despite centuries of social and technological change. Others might say that historians must, to avoid irrelevancy, contribute op-eds, produce podcasts, collaborate in videos and apps, co-author graphic publications. Andy's done that. Take up tweet storming, even dabble in internet memes. Maybe we should do it all. And I say collectively, we are. 2017 was a dismal year for America and the world, but a proud one for U.S. historians in the public sphere, who show that it's possible to tell simple, powerful stories without resorting to facile or false storytelling. Lest we feel smug, I have to point out that forest historians and the larger community of environmental historians always face narratological hazards. For that matter, so do foresters and forest ecologists who explain change with metaphors and stories as well as data and models. Actually, can you grab me my clicker? Thank you. I should clarify for the purposes of this talk, I'm not talking about things like implotment or meta-narrative, the progressive versus the declensionist, the heroic versus the ironic, and so on. Hayden White, rest in peace. Rather, I'm talking about micro-narrative, by which I mean plot elements, plot devices, stock characters. We all use them. We have to, consciously or unconsciously. To be specific, I want to highlight one familiar non-human character, the dying, doomed, or desecrated old tree. This natural figure of human grief can be real or fake, historic or mythic, most often something between. My first example you may remember from social media. Oh no, come on, clicker. Oh, let's try it again. Social media. Way back in 2014, when fake news seemed merely annoying rather than apocalyptic, the Canada-based World News Daily Report released an article with no byline claiming that the world's oldest tree, more than 5,800 years old by ring count, had been mistakenly felled in an indigenous reserve in the western Amazon. In a few unfunny paragraphs, the satirical piece packed in plot elements from an environmentalist morality play. You had sacred trees, pre-modern Indians, Berkeley-based do-gooders, and illegal loggers colluding with corrupt government officials and big oil. The fictional leader of the remote forest tribe lamented that the murder of the arboreal mother spirit had brought darkness upon not only our people, but the whole world. In its first week of release, this for-profit hoax was shared more than 250,000 times. By 2018, it had creeped to 500,000. This story was created to monetize the negative feelings of a target audience for whom it sounded plausible. And to be fair, indigenous forest peoples in Peru and Brazil do face serious encroachments like illegal logging. This fake news about the Amazon works because it echoes other stories in circulation. Any good tree hugger recalls the substance, if not the details, of Prometheus, truly the oldest tree by ring count ever known, a bristlecone pine cut down in 1964. In many narrations, including one by Radiolab, you may have heard, a graduate student killed Prometheus by accident. Oops. I mean, that's not quite accurate, but the point is that the hoax of the mother spirit probably got conflated, intentionally or not, with the legend of Prometheus and earlier histories like the mother of the forest. There's the stump of Prometheus. There's the mother of the forest, the giant sequoia, stripped of its bark for exhibition at the Crystal Palace. Not to mention the extraterrestrial felling of the home tree in Avatar, or the sacred cedar in the Epic of Gilgamesh. If I had more time, I could tell you a story from the 1930s about an unusually tall cycad in Australia that was leveled by vandals after being identified in newspapers throughout the English-speaking world as the oldest living thing at 15,000 years. The plot device of mistakenly or accidentally on purpose or intentionally or fatefully felling the oldest tree is about as old as it gets. Since the 19th century, when scholars in the West invented religion as a discrete category of analysis, the sacred tree has often been conceived as a non-Western primitive relic of animistic or totemistic or polytheistic religions. Famously, Lynn White blamed Christianity for killing the sacred tree. In fact, the sacred tree is alive today in Catholic countries like Mexico, in advanced countries like Japan, and it survives in the United States. You can see it. You probably have if you've gone there at Walt Disney World. Sometimes it takes neo-pagan form, like the tree named Luna by Julia Butterfly Hill, a redwood tree later attacked by a chainsaw. More often it takes quasi-Christian nationalistic form, like the General Grant, the nation's Christmas tree, or the Survivor tree at the 9/11 memorial. Additionally, Americans have, through dendrochronology, invented and promulgated a new post-secular category of venerated tree, trees enshrined for no other reason than scientists can tell us definitively that these trees are the oldest specimens of a certain species or in a given area. They leave little tags by their core holes. Instrumentally dated trees of exceptional age have become objects of ecotourism and scientific pilgrimage. Ironically, the very validation and enumeration of a tree's longevity produces apprehension about its mortality. Death always haunts the latest, oldest tree. The oldest of the old trees with legible growth rings are Great Basin bristlecone pines, Pinus longeve, a species that has become a key source of climate proxy data. For a close reading of the stories dendrochronologists have told with bristlecones, I recommend Michael Cohen's A Garden of Bristlecones, which might be the best environmental book that you haven't read. You really should, it's amazing. With the rest of my limited time, I'm going to explicate just one news story about bristlecone ecology and what it reveals about the challenge of narrating climate change. Late last summer, a group of botanists published a peer-reviewed article on, quote, divergent responses of tree species and life stages to climatic warming in Great Basin subalpine forests. To summarize, in the White Mountains of Eastern California, tree lines are ascending. Bristlecone pines so far have been less successful at colonizing the new growth zone than neighboring limber pines. The scientists describe limbers leapfrogging bristlecones in slow motion. Over time, Pinus longeva could face overall range contraction and possibly local extirpations, they said. What once might have been slow news or no news entered the fast news cycle. The lead author, an entrepreneurial PhD student, worked with a UC media officer to prepare a press kit. They changed the metaphor leapfrog in slow motion to race to the top, and implied that the Forest Service should try to fix the game so that Bristlecone wins. A local reporter recycled the press release, and then the AP issued it for syndication with a headline optimized for social sharing. In a matter of days, a technical study completed its conversion into clickbait. Future of oldest tree species on Earth in peril. This headline, like so many, is bogus. Ecologists are not worried about the extinction of bristlecone pine in the manageable future. There's no need for pilgrims to build little rock shelters for white mountain seedlings, as touching as this gesture may be. Bristlecones are tough little buggers. For the sake of imagination, though, let's assume that over the next 1,000 or 10,000 years of human-accelerated global warming, limber pine expands while bristlecone pine contracts. Would that by itself be reason for anxiety or sorrow? Why not praise the resilience of limber pine, Pinus flexilis, a tree that occurs from Canada to Mexico in high and low altitudes, a tree that achieves ages up to 2,000 years? Not too shabby. Or in the context of the Great Basin, why not acknowledge that for the Holocene end time, limbers and bristlecones are a sideshow? This is the age of single-leaf pinon pine, a submontane native species important to Paiutes and Western Shoshones, though maligned, chained, and poisoned by ranchers and foresters for its weedy and invasive growth. The snag in this hypothetical thinking is that limbers and piñons lack mystique. Only one tree species can hold the title, world's oldest, and bristlecone pine, or that Great Basin bristlecone pine to be exact, has been the champion since 1958, as unveiled by National Geographic. Here's the author of the article. The dethroned oldest title holder, giant sequoia, has remained iconic primarily because of its monumental size. During the historic drought of 2011 to 2017, journalists went to the Sierra Nevada again and again, and they talked to field experts asking, are the big trees dying? Are they imperiled? Are they doomed? And in fact, sequoias held up remarkably well. Reporters duly submitted stories about how the giants might succumb, ignoring all the tens of millions of dead and dying trees of other species all around them. And when news outlets belatedly did turn their attention to forest dieback, headlines portrayed it as a disaster instead of a potentially beneficial thinning of a Sierra forest still recovering from a disastrous policy of fire suppression. Beyond commercial factors, the algorithms that decide for us which stories are engaging, I wonder why so many people like trees in imminent danger. Perhaps James George Fraser, author of The Golden Bough, was right, and tree worship is a foundational element of human society. That's a Turner painting on the frontispiece. Or here's some other explanations by why people like these stories. Perhaps they're expressions of a new collective grief, climate despair, solastalgia, whatever you want to call it, maybe geoneurasthenia. I suppose people who have lost environmental hope may derive a kind of eco-schadenfreude from visualizing how anthropogenic change foredooms even the most persistent organisms. Or perhaps climate activists and now activist scientists believe, without any evidence, that alarmist stories will win over contrarians and deniers. I get this last motivation. Climate change is a long-term problem that engages System 2 thinking, but climate politics is an immediate problem that depends on System 1 thinking. Hoping to short-circuit the two systems, environmentalists turn to emotional proxies, polar bears, coral reefs, ancient trees. Now, one of these three is not like the others. Speaking terrestrially and across deep time, Planet Earth belongs to plants and their microbial allies. We animals, we're just passing through. The 5 mass extinctions and the looming 6 are mainly animal extinctions. Talk to paleobotanists and they will tell you that the fossil record reveals only 2, or maybe 0, great extinctions for the plant kingdom. After a catastrophic megadisturbance, the phylogenetic tree of life for plants apparently recovers more quickly and more completely. In the deep future that's already in the pipeline, many plants should thrive in a changed atmosphere, even as many sea animals struggle under a changed oceanic chemistry. I feel much more pessimistic about ocean ecosystems than forest ecosystems. Nevertheless, even within surviving forests, a massive reordering of communities and growth types will occur. As a general proposition, today's big old trees, these are the winners in an older, now obsolescent climate, will fall into the losing column. And this is true for subalpine bristlecones too, but on a different temporal scale than most other old trees. Dying, like living, just goes slower in the cold, dry air of the Great Basin's highest mountains. The famous population known as Schulman Grove, home of the so-called Methuselah tree, has been in place for the entirety of the Holocene, even as entire forests throughout the temperate zone have vanished or transformed during periods like the medieval warm anomaly and the Little Ice Age. Here's the Schulman Grove. Now, ecologists can make educated guesses about how bristlecone populations, which occur with and without limber, might change in the long term. But that's different, of course, than soothsaying. In a 2009 paper, tree ring researchers demonstrated that subalpine bristlecones have grown faster in the previous 50 years than any 50-year period in the previous 4 millennia. Is faster better? Whether global warming is good or bad for Pinus longeva depends on the time frame. For many reasons then, a Great Basin bristlecone pine is not like a polar bear, not like a coral reef. This arboreal icon of longevity is ill-suited to be an emblem for climate change if, by climate change, we only mean climate catastrophe. However, it might be a useful metaphor for the key word that has supplanted sustainability now that sustainability is stillborn. The word, of course, is resilience. Bristlecones start out looking like perfect little Christmas trees. They become contorted by surviving centuries of injuries. Trees in extreme environments put their energy into stability rather than growth, into dying slowly rather than living fully. The great dendrochronologist Edmund Schulman hypothesized about longevity under adversity in conifers, and this has proven to be a general principle in tree biology. In a recent synoptic paper, a team of forest ecologists speculated that the emerging climate of high variability and high intensity will select against large, fast-growing, full-canopied, healthy-looking trees and select for stunted, slow-growing trees that hold up to chronic stress and regular disturbance. In an anthropogenic climate defined by instability, deformed and low-grade trees, the trees that old-time foresters would call unhealthy, might actually prove to be the most resilient. Many conifer and mixed forests may, over time, begin to resemble bristlecone morphology, with an attendant shift from higher to lower carbon storage. This scenario is called the age of the mediocre forest. It may be developing already. This outcome would not be happy, but neither would it be hopeless. If you have read The Mushroom at the End of the World, you've read stories about a forest in ruins that is nonetheless full of surprising life, human and otherwise. Ancient bristlecone pines encourage long-term imagination. That's a precious resource in our political economy of short-termism. We can use this deeper time frame to grieve about the future dead. We might also take inspiration from these Methuselahs to think about the future living and their struggles and their sufferings. In the coming decades and centuries, the greatest climate victims will be the poor, vulnerable human populations in cities, regions, and nations unprepared for intense, interannual, stochastic events. This is a picture from Puerto Rico. A 2017 polling report from Yale, Climate Change in the American Mind, showed that Americans are more concerned about the climatic threat to plants than people. Speaking as a plant person, I think that's upside down. Humans must figure out, without the plant genius of being solar-powered life forms, our own species-wide, global-scale life strategy. Call it longevity under precarity. If we could only prepare for the certainty of uncertainty and tend to our world, bristlecoats, at least, would take care of themselves. Thank you.